Today we're going to go over the 4 main camera settings that every filmmaker should master. This is going to take your footage from this to this. First setting you need to master is shutter speed. So, shutter speed basically affects the motion blur of your image. An easy rule to remember is that your shutter speed should be twice your frame rate. So, if your frame rate is 24 frames per second, then you should have 1/48th of a second for your shutter speed. But you can't really get 1/48th of a shutter speed on most cameras, so you'll do 1/50th of a second. You can get 1/48th by using shutter angle on more video-centered cameras, but that's a video for another day. If you want to learn more about shutter angles, let me know. Let's look at a few examples of using shutter speed correctly.
I have 1/50th of a second for my shutter speed because my frame rate is 24 frames per second. You have to double whatever that is. So if I were to change this to 30 frames per second, I'd do 1/60. If I did 120 frames per second, I'd do 1/250. Okay, so in this first example, you can see the shutter speed is correct. So we have the proper motion blur in this video clip. It's what the eye naturally sees. Then in this next example, you'll see that the shutter speed is way off. It's 1/1250, which is super off, way more than double what our frame rate is at 24 frames per second. And so you'll see it has motion blur that is not natural. It's way too sharp, way too crispy, and it doesn't look right to the eye. So that's why you want to have your shutter speed double the frame rate.
So the second setting that you need to master is aperture. So aperture controls the little ring inside the center of your camera. So it kind of opens and closes based on what you set it at, and the smaller the number, the wider the ring is. This is important because it determines how much light is let into your image. It also helps determine your depth of field and how blurry your background is. If you want that nice blurry background behind you for a crispy shot, then you want a lower aperture. So 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, that's gonna get you a nice blurry background. But if you want the nice sun, rays coming out, then you're gonna want a higher aperture, like 22, and you're gonna start getting those different sun flares there.
Okay, so right here we see that we have our aperture at f2.8. That's the lowest that the lens on this camera goes right now. And because of that, the background behind him, you'll notice, is really blurry where he is in focus. But if we mess with our aperture and we darken the aperture to f22, you'll notice you can see the background of this clip a lot clearer, and I'll put those clips up on the screen so that you can see them as well. But that's what gets you that nice blurry background, is when your aperture is really low.
The third setting you need to master is ISO. So ISO is basically the sensor's sensitivity to light. So the more sensitive the image, the brighter it will be, and the less sensitive the image, the darker it will be. Another helpful way to think about ISO is as fake light. So as you bump up the ISO, you're adding more fake light into the image, and this is important because the higher the ISO, the more grainy the image and the more noisy it looks, which isn't great. And now that's just kind of for a standard picture profile. ISO acts a little bit differently with picture profiles. For example, if you're using S-Log3, the base ISO is 6400, and then there's a second base ISO as well. But we can talk about that in another video. For now, just think the lower the ISO, the better, the less noise that you're gonna have in your image.
Generally, you want your ISO as low as possible. So right now it is as low as possible and our subject is well lit. But if a room is too dark and you have to brighten it up, it will introduce grain into the image. But this is also why you want your shutter speed and your aperture low, because if they're higher, then you have to bump up your ISO, and that makes your image good. So just think you want everything lower, and then you're gonna get better images. So for example, if I crank up our shutter speed and our aperture, I really have to turn the ISO up quite a bit to compensate for that. When I have the settings higher, which forces me to increase the ISO, you'll notice that the image is a lot grainier, it falls apart way quicker, and it just doesn't look crisp, doesn't look clean, which is why you have everything lower, the aperture lower, the ISO lower. It just makes the image look all around better.
The fourth setting is white balance. Now you could use auto white balance, it works good on most cameras. And in fact, I'd even encourage you to use auto white balance until you've mastered the 3 other settings. But once you've mastered those 3, it's time to work on your white balance. With white balance, you have a few presets that you can use. There's tungsten, cloudy, daylight, but I would master the Kelvin scale.
Like I said, we have to look at the Kelvin, and this is what I have it at for daylight. I like it a little cooler, but daylight's more at 5500. But if we bring it all the way down to 3100, 3200, you'll see how cool and cold this image is. And that's because basically your Kelvin temperature set kind of compensates for how cool the environment is that you're in. So if you're in orange light inside, you're gonna lower this to that Kelvin so that it looks warmer. So outside in daylight, it looks really cool, but with orange light inside, you're gonna wanna turn that down. But since we're outside in daylight, we're gonna have this a little higher, and that is more of that natural sunlight. So if you get this off, it just ruins your footage, which is why white balance is so important, especially in camera, because it's one of the hardest things to fix when color grading. And this is on a Kelvin color scale. You don't always have that option in the camera. Sometimes it's only presets. So auto white balance often looks good. Then there's daylight settings, there's shade settings, cloudy settings, and then incandescent lights. And as you can see, that makes it pretty blue there. Just make sure you get that white balance correct, and it will really help your image.
Thank you all for watching. I hope you learned a little bit about those camera settings and are excited to go out and practice. If you guys like this video, go ahead and subscribe and hit that like button, and let me know what you guys want to see next. Thanks for watching.